Warning: this video contains content that some viewers may find upsetting, including barbarian pillaging, poorly drawn robots in awkward combat, inappropriate teacher-student relations, blatant glorifications of communism, and top 40 disco music. Viewer discretion is most certainly advised.
Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Seth Monahan, and I've got kind of a weird one for you today. It's not so much a harmony lesson as a sentimental tour through the sonic landscape of my youth. I call it Sequences from My Childhood. And for once, I'm not talking about classical music. This is about pop culture. But it links up with the last few videos by focusing specifically on the falling fifth sequences that were just in the air for regular people to hear in the decade that got us from Watergate to We Are the World. We're going to start with a little background, though. A big part of my job involves teaching people how to recognize sounds. And the fastest way to do that is to start by giving names to sounds they already know. This was how I started training my own ears when I was a teenager. Now, these days, I mainly teach people about the European classics of the 18th and 19th centuries. But when I first got curious about that music, which I did not grow up with, it was like a foreign language to me. I mean, I'd heard plenty of orchestral music. My core musical memories were basically all film scores. But by the late 1980s, when I was actually compelled to study and make music of my own, my tastes had changed somewhat. Maybe I had to be there. The point is that a lot of the sounds in Beethoven and Mozart were totally new to me. But not all of them, it turned out. Somehow, in this music from hundreds of years ago, there were sounds that already lived in my head rent-free. And tenet number one was the thing you and I call a falling fifth sequence. Now, to be clear, I grew up in the West, so even as a kid, I had probably heard music that sounded like this, paired with images like this. But I would also have done my best to forget about them, because, well, you know. Now, the sequences that stuck were from pop culture. Films, TV shows, music videos. And what fascinates me is the possibility that my little kid brain was making connections that it wasn't even aware of. So when I finally learned what these things were called, I already had like a mental stockpile of them. This video is about that stockpile. It asks how a kid born in the 70s got certain sounds burned into his brain, not by studying music, just by being immersed in culture. It has two parts. In the first, we'll hear sounds that were just kind of in the air in the late 70s, on the radio and on TV, before I was old enough to, choose my own entertainment. Then it's on to the early 80s, when I was a bit older, and where the sequences come from movies and songs and shows that I thought of as, my own. So first, the 1970s. The thing about my three examples from the 1970s is that each has some sort of caveat. The first is the ubiquitous disco hit I Will Survive, performed by Gloria Gaynor. And this one maybe has the biggest caveat because the melody isn't really sequential. We'll come back to that. The song makes the cut, though, because the whole thing is one giant falling fifth progression. The intro, the verse, and the chorus all start on tonic and work their way around the circle of fifths in A minor. This is one of the last times we hear the chorus. Okay, so a second ago I said that the melody wasn't really sequential. Let me walk that back a bit. I should say first, as a general principle, when you're dealing with pop vocals, which usually aren't notated and are often embellished in one way or another, you're just not going to get the kind of copy-paste sequences you find in Haydn or Mozart. You have to be flexible. And in this case, the melody seems like it sort of wants to follow the sequence, but also like it sort of can't. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we squint at the model, it's clear that A natural is the main melodic note over the first two chords. And if it's part of the sequence, that main melodic note is going to want to go down by step with each copy. So the next stop should be G over the 7 and 3 chords, and that's what we get. And after that would come F natural over the next 2 chords. But that's where we get into trouble. Now, this is debatable, but to my ears, this melody has a strongly pentatonic feel to me. It's obviously not literally pentatonic, like all the notes of the melodic minor are in there somewhere, but the bones of the melody feel to me like they're from the pentatonic scale. And that scale doesn't have an F natural. So the anchor note G can't go down by step to stick with the sequence. Instead, it has to go to the next note of the scale, which is E. So you get E natural over these 6 and 2 chords, which sounds interesting because it's actually not part of those chords. Now, I knew none of this, obviously, when I was a child. I was 3 when this song came out. So this isn't music I would have heard in an actual, disco establishment. No, this is music I heard from the back seats of cars, and not, I might add, cars that any of you little snowflakes today would recognize. I'm talking 70s era cars, which didn't have seatbelts or child restraints because they didn't need them. If you crashed one of those suckers, the secondhand smoke was going to keep you pinned right in your seat, basically like an airbag that gave you cancer. Anyway, speaking of medical emergencies, our next stop is the Korean War comedy MASH. Now, this is a weird one because, on the one hand, the show is a cult classic. Diehards swear that it's one of the best ever made. On the other hand, it's the kind of thing that makes absolutely no sense at all to a 5 or 6-year-old. I just could not figure out what was up with this show. Because here's the thing. Sometimes MASH acted like a serious TV drama about war and its human cost. Look, right here in the title sequence, you've got these medics running like people's lives literally depend on them. Okay. But then you also have this guy with his, shall we say, extravagant sartorial choices.
Klinger! Sir! Colonel Potter, sir!
Very smart outfit.
Terrific outfit, Klinger.
Like it? I don't usually wear floor length during the day, but once in a while you feel like being dressy.
In every episode with the laugh track and, I don't judge. All this is just a little hard to parse when you're too young to tie your own shoes. But while we're on the topic of baffling contradictions, let's talk about the music that played over the show's opening credits. When I was 5 years old, it just, broke my brain that sounds could be, at the very same time, undeniably catchy and utterly depressing. Now, years later, I realized that this actually made some sense. Turns out MASH was based on a movie of the same name from 1970, which featured a song with the inscrutable title, Suicide is Painless. Well, the music that landed me in therapy as an adult was just a wordless rendition of that song, thus the complex tone. But tone is not the only thing that sets this music apart from I Will Survive. In terms of their sequences, they're kind of opposites. Because now we have a melody that is sequential and descends by step. You can see here there's a model and 2.5 copies. And it turns out that you could, in theory, harmonize it with like an off-the-shelf circle of fifths progression. It would sound like this. But that's not actually what it does. The composer, Johnny Mandel, doesn't actually give us the 6th chord here. Instead, he goes back to tonic and then starts a new falling 5th progression from there, which goes back through chords we've already heard. Here is the actual title sequence. But that's actually just the first half of the song. The second half, it turns out, is not sequential, even though it starts with the same 4 opening chords. And it wraps up with a closing idea that is really unclassical in its sound because it doesn't use any leading tones in minor. The tune itself is from the minor pentatonic. And it approaches the final tonic chord not from 5 like Mozart would, but from A major, the subtonic chord, which comes from the natural minor. Again, it's a very unclassical sound. Now, my last clip from the 70s finally gives us an actual sequence. It's the chorus of Killing Me Softly, which Roberta Flack made into a huge hit in 1973. This is a fantastic song, so you should really go listen to the whole thing when you have a chance. We're going to dive in with the chorus, which starts with a 1 model, 1 copy falling 5th sequence in a 4-flat signature. And just FYI, I'm going to be playing you a live recording from later in the 70s because I could not get permission to use the original.
Strumming my pain with his fingers, singing my life with his words.
Now, a little sidebar here. You just heard me say 4-flat signature a second ago, not F minor or A flat major. There's a reason for that. One of the things I love about this song is that you can't shoehorn it into a single key. There are at least 3 keys in play: A flat major, F minor, and B flat minor, and some people might throw in E flat as well. But we never commit to any of them for long. The tonal center drifts around, blurs, and comes back into focus in ways that are hard to describe. So all this means that the song is terrible for Roman numeral analysis. If you can't say what key you're in, you can't use Roman numerals. So I'm not. Anyway, the sequence is actually kind of short. It's only the first third of the chorus. And yet, it puts some musical elements into play that stay relevant all the way to the end. The first one is harmony. When the sequence is done, we go back to F minor, the original starting chord, and then launch a new falling 5th progression. Now, this one's not a sequence, but the root of each chord, and they all happen to be major, the root of each chord is a perfect 5th lower than the one before, just like the sequence. This takes us flatward into B flat minor, where we get a half cadence. Now, you probably noticed that I skipped a bar. What's going on there? Well, that's because there's a chord, this D flat major triad, that doesn't actually fit into the falling 5th progression. In fact, this one stray chord throws my ear off so completely, I didn't even notice the falling 5ths till I started analyzing the song.
Killing me softly with his song, killing me softly with his song, telling my whole life with his words, killing me softly with his song.
Now, the other thing that the rest of the chorus inherits from the sequence is just this general idea of descending by step. Because if you squint your ears just right, you could hear the entire second half of the chorus as a single stepwise descent. In bar 5, we get to the highest note in the whole song, B flat. And it moves down directly into A flat and G, which is where the first 2 vocal phrases started. And then from there, every single bar starts with a non-chord tone that resolves down by step into a chord tone. And if you take all those stepwise resolutions together, they make a single 4-flat diatonic scale going all the way from the highest note of the chorus to the lowest one. But we can't leave that low B flat hanging because it has to move up to the half cadence at the end of the phrase. You can listen for all this when I play you a video of the live recording.
A stranger to my eyes, strumming my pain with his fingers, singing my life with his words, killing me softly with his song, killing me softly with his song, telling my whole life with his words, killing me softly with his song.
Now, I like that we've landed on a half cadence here, because it's time to pivot into part 2 of the video. Now, it might not shock you that as we turn to things that I thought were really cool when I was 7 years old, there might be, an accompanying, shall we say, drop in artistic depth. At least with my first example, which is the theme song to the original 1984 animated series in the then brand new Transformers franchise. Now, like so many kids' shows from that era, this series was a cynical, low-effort cash grab. It was trash whose only function was to sell toys. But the music was catchy, and for some reason, the climax of the song features a falling fifth sequence. So I'm going to play the video clip first with notation, and then we can notice a few interesting things about the sequence itself.
More than meets the eye. Autobots wage their battle to destroy the evil forces of the Decepticons. Transformers.
The first thing to notice here is rhythm. I don't think we've had a sequence use a hemiola before, but now we do. We are in 4/4, but the model and the copy are each only 3 beats long, which means that they all start at different places in the bar. The next thing to notice is the, shall we say, improbably rich nature of the chords themselves. Not only do all the chords have sevenths, the first one in each unit also has a ninth. Listen when I play it back a little slower. Now you're probably wondering what's up with the red 4/7 chord. It's red because it breaks the sequence. What should be here is a 2 half-diminished ninth chord, but that sounds pretty harsh. It could be like dangerous to small children or something. So the composers decided to soften it by leaving the bass out, giving us a minor 7th chord with a different root to serve as the predominant. All this being said, there's still the broader question of why a show about robots that turn into cars and cassette decks should have harmonies worthy of Debussy or Duke Ellington. But then I remembered, let's roll the tape back here, the race car guy, the Autobot, what's his name? Right there, him, what's his name? It's Jazz. So my theory is that I think he probably wrote the chords. That's what I believe. Moving onward and slightly upwards at least, we have Basil Polidorus' score for the 1982 film Conan the Barbarian. Now the hero, as you may know, is played by a young and usually heavily oiled Arnold Schwarzenegger. But before he was too big to fit into any known shirts, Conan was a young boy whose village was attacked by raiders from some kind of depraved snake cult. Now, these raiders are a nasty bunch. Their thing, apparently, is to just chop up all the adults they see and make slaves of their children. So, yes, total creeps. Now, I want it on record that I think most of this score is fantastic. But I have to wonder why anyone thought it was a good idea to score the raiders' invasion scene with fake Baroque music. Because that is where we find our falling fifth sequence. Yeah, this is a tough one. I mean, what is this? This music sounds like a Brandenburg Concerto cosplaying as Carmina Burana. And the question is, why? Are we supposed to understand that this isn't just any snake cult? This is, a snake cult of uncommonly refined tastes. These guys are maybe like former church organists and Latin instructors. I mean, look, they get high scores for physical fitness. You can't say that about all cults. And thrift, too. Thrift. I mean, just look at the money they'd be saving each year by cutting each other's bangs with axes. Anyway, I don't have any special insights on this one. Make of it what you will. In the meantime, let's head over to MTV for my favorite Falling Fifth sequence in all of pop music. I'm talking about the chorus to Lionel Richie's 1984 hit single, Hello. Now, I gotta say, this is a powerhouse of a ballad by one of the greatest singers of his generation, and its Falling Fifth sequence features a Neapolitan, just like we heard in Conan the Barbarian. But the music video, which I think was intended to be like high-concept stuff 40 years ago, it looks really different in a slightly more enlightened era. Like, honestly, it's a bit of a doozy. So here goes. In a nutshell, Lionel Richie plays a drama teacher with an extracurricular interest in this young woman, who also happens to be blind, which means he has a kind of a free pass to hover and gawk pretty much everywhere she goes. Band rehearsal, at lunch, in the hallway where there are lockers, folks, so this is not college. In a ballet class, Lionel. And as the last chorus comes up, he's just finished calling her at home at night, like you do if you want to get arrested.
Hello, is it me you're looking for?
But what a chorus!
'Cause I wonder where you are, and I wonder what you do. Are you somewhere feeling lonely? Is someone loving you? Tell me how to win your heart, for I haven't got a clue. But let me start by saying I love you.
Honestly, I just feel kind of bad. Lionel Richie seems like a great guy, and the song is a masterpiece, so maybe we can just take heart in the fact that the story has a happy ending. The young lady was apparently so moved by the song's sequential chorus that she runs off to art class and, I guess, magically sculpts Lionel Richie, but as a Greek god. And after that, well, they have to live happily ever after, as soon as she's old enough to vote. Next year.
Hello, is it me you're looking for?
Anyway, our last stop on the Falling Fifth train is the soundtrack to the beloved fantasy epic The Dark Crystal. Now, I can't even pretend to be objective here. I have adored this movie for like 40 years. It's the brainchild of Jim Henson, the genius behind the Muppets. And it was sort of a bid to show that live-action puppetry could tell serious stories. And yeah, sure, the story itself is a tale as old as time. There's a little guy who leads a simple life out in the sticks, but then fate sends him on a quest to save the world from encroaching evil. Whatever, the story's fine. The movie's real brilliance, though, I think lies in two things. One is just the world building. The whole thing is visually unforgettable, especially if you saw it at an impressionable age. The other thing that stands out is the soundtrack by South African composer Trevor Jones, who uses some really clever thematic transformations to help the music itself tell a story. We're going to get to the Falling Fifth sequence in a second, but first I want to put it in some context. This is the movie's main theme, which represents the opening state of affairs. There's a fallen world, but also a prophecy that promises its redemption. When that redemption arrives in the very last scene, we hear what seems at first to be a totally different theme. but it's actually just a transformation of the prophecy theme. Let's break this down. The prophecy theme has two main ideas. The first is this, which comes back with the same rhythm and contour, just different intervals. And that idea overlaps with a second motive, which is a kind of turn figure. Step down, leap up by fourth, then step down again. Well, that's in the redemption theme too, but with the rhythm and one of the intervals changed. It's easy to miss this because the harmony is completely different, but the close connection of themes is part of the musical storytelling, and we lose a lot if we miss it. Well, it turns out there's another theme as well, which I call the quest, which we hear at several points in the story, which acts as a kind of missing link between these other two. This is where we find our sequence, which is by far the least classical sounding of any we've heard, thanks to the chords it uses. Or maybe I should just say the chord it uses, because it only uses one type. They're all major seventh chords. Now, in video 41, we saw sequences made from a single type of chord, but those were all dominant sevenths. That's a very classical sound, but a chain of major sevenths is pretty much unthinkable in that style. So when I play the quest theme, notice how it predicts, especially at first, the rhythm of the redemption theme that comes later. Now, there's a reason that I call this sequence the quest theme. We first hear it when the hero, Jen, is summoned to receive his mission, and then we hear it again when he sets out on the journey itself. And I like this a lot because it's the most harmonically active of the three themes by far. The prophecy theme just holds a single sonority, basically. And the redemption theme basically just vamps between two chords. But the quest theme is propelled forward by its harmony. It goes places. It even begins and ends in different keys, like any good story. So, speaking of stories, before this one ends today, we're going to check out one more sequence from 1980s pop culture. It's from Rocky IV, a film that played out the Cold War rivalry of the US and the USSR in the boxing ring, as the Italian stallion Rocky Balboa took on the hulking Soviet champ Ivan Drago. And he does it in Russia, where Drago's entrance is choreographed in full Soviet-era pomp, including, not surprisingly, a rendition of the Soviet national anthem, which, frankly, blew my prepubescent mind. Now, as a 10-year-old, my understanding of geopolitics was limited and mainly informed by Stallone's other movies. So I could not understand how our mortal enemies could have such a badass national anthem, while ours, at least until that point in history, had been cool like exactly one time for 4 minutes. Then again, there was a lot I didn't know when I was 10, like the fact that the middle part of the Soviet anthem was clearly a sequence. More than that, maybe you noticed, maybe you didn't, it's not a sequence that descends by step like the falling fifth model always does. No, this was a sequence that descended by thirds. And it is, big shocker, the topic of my next video, which I promise you has nothing whatsoever to do with Rocky, the Cold War, or the 1980s in general. This has been fun, but it's time to get back to our usual beat, which is the 1780s. So grab your powdered wigs and I'll see you there.